why don't you jump on that and
Yep.
comment on that?
Yep. I mean, political dialogue is obviously necessary. I think it's the only route forward. And indeed, Pretoria was quite explicit on this front about the need for kind of a long-term dialogue between Tigrayan authorities, the TPLF, and the federal government on a range of issues. But I do think, to Adala's point, and I think, Peyton would agree, there has to be an active diplomatic coalition, right, to actually push that dialogue forward. And we have to keep in mind how we actually got to the Pretoria Agreement, right? It was a coalition between the AU, key AU member states, the Kenyans, I think, played a role, the South Africans, and a push by the United States to actually, create the diplomatic energy and the focus to bring the parties to Pretoria and actually consolidate this, or not consolidate, but reach an actual agreement. And I wonder, is that coalition still in existence at this point in time, right? Working in concert to push the parties forward. I think that coalition needs to be rehabilitated, right? And it needs to, I think, get back to work on this issue and think about the kinds of security guarantees, the kinds of financial commitments and incentives that can be used to kind of grease the wheels of Pretoria and get it back on track. The other piece of this, and this is not something we've talked about, is the role of other extra-regional actors, particularly in the Middle East. Everyone is aware, obviously, about events unfolding in Sudan. I think one of the key policy questions there is how can the United States and other concerned actors kind of mitigate or manage the role of Middle Eastern powers that are on various sides of the conflict, kind of fueling hostilities. I think that is also a question that is relevant to the Ethiopian conflict, right? Because in the event of a conflict, different sides of it, right, are going to try and mobilize the contending coalitions in Sudan, external coalitions, right? Whether it's the UAE, whether it's Egypt. And so, as we work through a kind of African mechanism to address this, to de-escalate tensions in northern Ethiopia, we also have to keep in mind the broader extra-regional picture and kind of managing the influence of some of those actors. That to me is a very key question.
No, absolutely. And I think we'll come back to that because we do have some time now to talk about policy prescriptions, because I think that's the obvious segue here. So let's go back. Peyton, you were talking about this a little earlier, but let's start with you. So we're looking at the steps that Washington can take to support sustainable peace. So talk about that. And to Mike's point, is there a coalition that exists out there that might help push?
I think it's important that Mike put it on the table, and he's certainly right about the history, right? I mean, obviously, the United States did play an instrumental role, but it was not a unilateral role in bringing Pretoria into being. And I mean, for example, President Kenyatta and others were instrumental in closing the deal, as it were. And so I do think, I mean, again, I'm struck by the number of conversations I have where senior folks throughout the region, and I mean, certainly Washington and Europe as well, but in the immediate region, the degree of concern they raise about the risks and what they see as the impact on their own interests, whether they're in Kenya or some, other sort of quote unquote frontline states. And so I do think, I would like to think that could be catalyzed into a more concerted effort to prevent some of the scenarios we're discussing. I think Mike also raises another important point, if I may, which is that we need to look at this absolutely in the regional context, right? I mean, I may look young, but I've worked on Horn of Africa for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. Others have worked on it longer, God knows. But this is about as bad as I've ever seen the region, the worst state I've seen the region in, not just because of Sudan, but because of some of the other issues we've talked about. And this is a region, as everyone, Mike and Sadala know very well, that is prone to secessionist movements. And this is a region that is not, and increasingly even less committed as time goes on, to the notion of sovereignty and to the notion of territorial unity and integrity and to the notion of sacrosanct borders. And some of these fundamental norms, my view is, need to be front and center in terms of any diplomatic effort, because despite all of the challenges within the states, we at least need to stand by the principle of the fact that borders matter, that states are in fact sovereign, that there's not a right to seize territory to mount an aggressive campaign one way or another, either through proxies or overtly in this region. And that is, I think, a platform, for lack of a better word, that a sort of diplomatic coalition, to take Mike's phrase, is well suited to advance and sort of draw a line in the sand in terms of what is acceptable to not acceptable. And I think that's been done to some extent, right? I don't want to make it sound as if certainly the United States and I think others have conveyed in very strong terms their firm belief that there should not be a war between Eritrea, that military means is not the way to pursue access to the sea, for example. But that needs to be an ongoing, sustained, effort built, as Mike said, on a coalition that ensures that the sort of the better angels, as it were, prevail in the various capitals as they weigh their next steps.
Better angels and line in the sand, but not a red line. We no longer draw red lines. So Tadali, I want you to focus on what steps Washington can take. And you've been making this point that Pretoria had no guarantor. So do you think that the U.S., with the EU and the AU, cannot see themselves as arbiters, but instead as guarantors? And if so, what does that look like?
Thank you, Nick. It looks like taking a step back to how it was signed and to revisit what are the provisions included in the Pretoria Agreement, because right now even that is blurred. It has just it was lost in the details over the past 3 years. I think a good step would be a step